Hello, everybody. Joining in person, not too many, but many of you hopefully online today. And thank you for attending a webinar of the EFPA project group on eHealth by Jonas Eimontas. First and foremost, maybe some basic house rules and information. So this meeting is being recorded, or this webinar is being recorded. And afterwards, we'll be sure to send you both the recording as well as the PowerPoint slides for your consideration. Second, you can actually ask questions throughout the webinar. You can use the Q&A section of Zoom for that in particular. But we'll try to group them all together up until the very end, and hopefully we'll have some room to address all of them. Some basic broader context before handing it over to Jonas. So this is an event by the project group on eHealth. Some of you might have heard about this event through EFPA member associations. EFPA is the European Federation of Psychologists Associations. So we have 37 member states across Europe. And many of you are joining in from Spain, Italy, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, just to name a few, Slovenia as well. Hi, guys. We aim to provide the EFPA and its member associations with up-to-date information and guidelines and support when it comes to using eHealth in routine care and in clinical practice. And these webinar series are exactly a part of just that. So we have quite the number of representatives, but are also always welcoming more of them. So if you're in a country that doesn't have a representative just yet, don't hesitate to reach out to your member association to check if you could, for example, be involved in future endeavors. And if you have particular questions regarding your own country, you can always reach out to these people. You can find lots of information and contact information on ehealth.efpa.eu. There's more stuff there as well, some online resources of past work that we've done ever since I think we commenced with this in 2015. So it's there's quite some resources available there. And as I said, this is a webinar series. We had a kickoff generic symposium in Vilnius a couple of months ago. This is what we call a hybrid meeting. The other ones will just take place fully online. I myself will be telling you something more on this September 12th on immersive technologies for mental health. Andreas Schwertfeger will tell us a little bit more on September 26th on EMAs and just-in-time interventions. We have David Gossard, who will be telling us a bit more about machine learning in mental health, a very hot topic right now, I assume also. And finally, in collaboration with the Board of Prevention and Promotion, Niels Peter Richard will be telling us a bit more about global online classrooms and how you can use them to educate caregivers of abandoned children. Common across all of these webinars, and there will be more to come in the foreseeable future as well, is that we aim to make it especially relevant for practice. So if you're a clinician, if you want to know what you can or do, should or shouldn't do using this technology, that's the kind of information that we hope to give you. And that's hopefully what Jonas will be telling you a little bit more about today as well. To save you the effort of introducing yourself, I made a quick slide. So Jonas is a postdoctoral fellow and assistant professor at Vilnius University, and he mainly focuses, and this might not, hopefully doesn't come as a surprise, on internet-delivered psychological interventions, which is also the main topic of his talk today, obviously. He looks at one hand on effectiveness, primarily for depression, anxiety, and stress-related disorders. On the other hand, also looking into some of the more challenging bits that we see in this particular domain regarding engagement, adherence, and the role of the therapist to keep these type of interventions going and effective and reaching their full potential, basically. Finally, as I said, we thrive on collaboration with the different EFPA member associations, and Jonas is also a member of the EFPA project group on eHealth, where he represents the Lithuanian Psychological Association. So that's it for me. If you have any questions afterwards or right now, just feel free to ask them through the chat. We'll be happy to answer them as they come along, and some of them also at the end, depending on the type of questions, obviously. And with that, I would like to give you the floor and my little pointer as well. So Jonas Eimontas, thank you very much.
Thank you. We haven't checked if they hear people attending online, if they hear us all right.
Everything should be working properly, but if it doesn't...
No complaints in the chat?
No complaints. Yes, I got a thumbs up, so you got a thumbs up as well, so you're good to go.
Okay, good. So, down for the introduction, and I would add actually to the introduction that I'm also a practicing psychologist, clinical psychologist at the psychiatric hospital in Vilnius. I work in a department for suicide prevention. So that's probably relevant because I know the healthcare system from the inside, and know how sometimes it's hard to bring in new initiatives, new technologies into the healthcare system. So, okay, but as Tom mentioned, the aim of this webinar is to give practitioners a better understanding of what internet-based interventions are, and this is not some of these things I'm going to be talking about won't be new to researchers in the field. Most of them are not, but hopefully this will shed some light on what to expect in your practice and in your hospitals, mental health care centers at some point in time, because these interventions are rolling in and they're being adopted, they're being implemented into routine care. So you will probably, sooner or later, you will probably have to deal with that, and will be asked to consult on implementing them. So there are some specific points that you might find useful. Okay, so the agenda for this talk. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit of what the internet-based interventions are and what they are not. We will then address efficacy and effectiveness and see how from controlled, randomized controlled trials from controlled environments, these interventions translate into routine care and what effects we find there. We will then talk a little more about target audience and how to apply internet-based interventions for inpatients and outpatients, and also in private counseling. What's the difference there? Some of you might be familiar, but to others, you'll learn more about what is blended treatment and stepped care. And also, we will discuss the importance of therapist support, and actually, if we need highly trained psychologists and psychotherapists for some of these interventions. Also, I will point out why research should be part of these internet-based interventions, and how it is actually easy and useful to implement questionnaires and feedback for our patients in the systems themselves. And last, I will give you some of the success stories, successful implementation examples in private and public practice across the world. Right. So, what internet-based interventions are and what they are not. I really like this paper by Evelina Šmoktunovič and colleagues, where they try to understand more about the terminology in the field of internet-based interventions. And what they found was that there's a vast options to choose from you see here, computer-assisted therapy, cyber therapy, digital health, and so on and so on and so on. And also telepsychology, teletherapy. And it is then hard to understand what exactly are we talking about. Are we talking about the same thing when we're talking about the effectiveness for, say, for depression, for anxiety, for other common psychological problems? And this is why I really like this classification by Munoz and colleagues. I show it often. You probably have seen it if you heard any of my talks. But for me, I think it tends to show the basic benefits of internet-based interventions. So if you take a look at the first column here, type 1 services, these are our traditional face-to-face therapies, and what they are, that they are consumable, which means that we need 1 hour of therapist time to provide 1 hour of therapy to the patient, and it's a resource that we cannot multiply, we cannot make use, differently. So type 1 are those face-to-face interventions. Then we have type 2, which are interventions that are also consumable. These are teletherapy or online counseling. Same as face-to-face, we just use different modality, where we employ Zoom, we employ Skype, we employ other types of communication services to give the therapy through distance, so to speak. Right. So, and then we move to type 3 interventions, which is the main focus of today's talk as well. So these are interventions that have a lot of materials for participants to read, to videos to look at, questionnaires to fill in, and so on. And they are still consumable. They still require therapist time, ideally, but they require less time. And just last week, Professor David Clark from Oxford, he presented their data in routine care, where they managed to, I think, triple down the time therapists need to spend on. Oh yeah. I can speak up. Good. So still requires therapist time, but less so, because a lot of knowledge, a lot of expertise is then transported or given through the materials in the intervention itself. So we can give a lot of psychoeducation, feedback with exercises and through questionnaires, and we use less therapist time. The last one here, type 4, those are non-consumable interventions. That would be self-help books, for example, or self-help material online. Like anyone can download it. You just use up your computer space, but other than that, you don't consume anything else. So it's very accessible, but also there are issues with them, and we'll address them a little later in the talk. So our main focus today is type 3 interventions. That means mostly self-help, but with guidance, with therapist guidance. Right. So what are those interventions? Well, mostly those are cognitive behavioral therapy-based interventions, and those are mostly researched, but not only. A systematic review and meta-analysis by Lindegard from 3 years ago identified 7 studies for internet-delivered psychodynamic therapy with moderate to large effect sizes for different mood disorders. So it's mostly CBT, but not only, and we have therapies that are usually considered not really easy to implement online, also being implemented online. So that's important to keep in mind. Okay, how would a therapy like that look? This is an example from our own study for depressed older adults in Lithuania. It usually involves modules, weekly prescribed modules so that the patient could go step by step and not be overwhelmed by the amount of materials in the intervention. And also, it usually incorporates chat function, sometimes even video counseling function on the platform, and that's how it looks. We would ask our participants, our clients, to read through the materials, also practice, for example, relaxation techniques or behavioral activation, do behavioral activations exercises, and then report their experiences in the intervention itself, in the platform itself. So that's just one of the examples. Of course, there are a lot of more gamification and interactiveness involved in other platforms. But what's common for all of them is that they use a lot of material, and a lot of expertise is put into the text, into the videos, into the audio guidance, and these are the common things for them. Right. So also, just to give you some overview what we do in Vilnius. So we did some studies for depression, also for tinnitus distress, an ongoing study of ours, also PTSD, adjustment disorder, and so on. Right. This is not the main topic of our talk today, but I think it's an illustrative one. David Baker from Australia published a paper in 2016 about mental health apps readily available, like off-the-shelf apps readily available in Google Store and in Apple Store. And what he found is that like less than 1% of the apps in the stores readily available were actually researched. Other studies found that content in those apps, not only in apps, but also in internet-based interventions, sometimes does not overlap with recommendations from psychological associations, from professional organizations about the standards for treatment of these conditions. So more work is needed here as well. Right. So now let's talk about efficacy and effectiveness. And we use term efficacy usually to describe effects in very controlled, randomized controlled trials, and then effectiveness in routine care or clinical practice as such. And we see that internet-based interventions have been found to be efficacious for psychiatric conditions, like mood disorders, and also anxiety disorders, but also pathological gambling, eating disorders, drug addictions, and so on. But also, they were efficacious for somatic and health problems. And we see the headache, tinnitus, hearing loss, even multiple sclerosis symptoms can be alleviated. Lastly, these common psychological problems, as couple therapy, parent training, and procrastination, have also been treated with internet-based interventions, and good effects were found for them as well. So these are the RCTs and controlled conditions. What's more, when compared to internet-based interventions compared to face-to-face interventions, equivalent, say CBT, face-to-face CBT for depression, and online or internet-based CBT with therapist guidance for depression, we see that we find comparable effects, and sometimes even higher in internet-based interventions for such conditions as social anxiety disorder, panic disorder, also phobias, insomnia, and so on. This is I think, Yeah, it's not an old meta-analysis, but it's also it's now 5 years old. So keeping in mind the pace at which studies are done in this field right now, I think you need to revise it is approaching really fast. Right. Yeah. So we see the comparing these face-to-face to internet-based interventions. The effects are virtually the same. For some conditions, I have a pointer. Yeah, for some conditions it's higher for face-to-face. For some it's higher for internet-based interventions. Right, but how does this translate to routine care? And there has been some studies done by this is a study by Anderson and Hedman, and they found that it translates pretty well into routine care with large effect sizes mostly. For tinnitus, the study was a little smaller, but for panic disorder, for post-traumatic stress disorder, for the depression, burnout, social anxiety, they found good, like large effect sizes also in routine care. So it seems that with proper implementation, we can actually achieve good results even in routine care, where there's less controlled environment, less and more room for mistakes. So efficacy seems to be good. What's more, a study by Cross and colleagues showed that this was published this year. They showed that in routine care in Australia, there's an e-mental health clinic. They use data from their e-mental health clinic, and what they found was that we can see improvements in impairment, and they are not necessarily related to improvements in symptoms of depression and anxiety and so on. So people can start functioning better after internet-based interventions, even if their symptoms haven't reduced so much. Right. What's more, when we look at when we compare internet-based interventions in routine care, when we compare it with some other types of treatments, for example, cell health bibliotherapy, also type 4 intervention, non-consumable, and also psychoeducational group that uses less therapist time because we have a group and only one therapist. So we see that internet-based interventions guided are more effective than other conditions. All right. So now we move on to the role of the clinician, and what I did just these last few minutes, I was talking about the intervention and how it can be effective, but the clinician or psychologist also plays a huge role here, and we see that for people to uptake internet-based interventions, it's easier if it is recommended by the clinician. And so if he supports the idea of enrolling or entering internet-based intervention, this is critical for users to start using. And this is important because, as I'll show you later, attitudes towards internet-based interventions are worse for clinicians than for patients. But also if your clinician or your psychologist does not endorse or does not recommend, it's going to be harder for you to to enter such intervention. Okay, so getting back to the classification of internet-based interventions, and I mentioned that non-consumable is the type 4 interventions, self-help, actually, mostly self-helping interventions, right? But do they work? Like, why do we need internet, not internet, but why do we need therapist-guided interventions if we can use non-consumable interventions? And do we actually, if we use some kind of support system in our interventions, do we actually need highly trained therapists? Do we need licensed psychologists or licensed psychotherapists? Well, there are a few important things to keep in mind before deciding, so to speak. What studies have found is that if it's easy to enroll in the program, it's really easy to roll out and drop out of the intervention. A study by Australian colleagues, Christensen and colleagues, they did a study on Mood Gym, and they found I think I might have invented this number actually, because but something like that. I think it was 97, but very large dropout rates. It was actually termed the law of attrition. The law of attrition in internet-based interventions, that the vast majority of participants drop out in the first days and they never return. And that's actually, that shouldn't surprise us. Like if we look at how users just of technology in general interact with their apps and their smartphones, that's what we do. Like we download an app, we open it and like, oh, no, thanks. And we either forget it in the phone and delete it when the phone starts telling us almost out of storage, and then we look for the apps to delete, or we just delete it straight away. But this is the same principle, and I think that this is also cultural. What we saw in our studies is that it is less so for older generation, for people not very used or who don't engage with technology so much. What we saw is that age actually makes an effect, has an impact on attrition, and our older participants were the most active ones, and the ones who dropped out less. And we think that it might be connected to the thing that it's like they see it more as a treatment, more as a usual or a traditional treatment program that they enroll into, and not just any other app or a social media page or something. So there's actually some you can distinguish groups who would drop out more. Yeah, in the study we did for adjustment disorder, this was we compared standalone or without therapist support with therapist support, same conditions, but one group would get therapist support on demand. And what we saw is that not in our study, that's not true. Like we didn't get better effects here. Some studies do, but not us. But we got more engagement and less attrition. So our participants would come back and fill in questionnaires with, more often than those who had no therapist support. Okay, so now let's talk about target populations and also blended treatments and stepped care. What are those? So for stepped care, like first let's talk what it is, and then we'll move to the findings from the studies. But for stepped care is when we have internet-based intervention as part of treatment, as part of treatment of sequence of treatment. Let's say we know that there are really long waiting times in some countries, some mental health services, and in trying to reduce those waiting times, stepped care was introduced. That means you can get low intensity internet-based intervention for the time you wait. So that if you have to wait like, I don't know, 2 months, you can use an intervention, self-help intervention for 2 months that hopefully will reduce your suffering and improve your impairment. And there was a service called Beating the Blues in the United Kingdom a while ago now. And they, when they analyzed the data, they saw that people who entered this step-tiered module, we can say module, I guess, they benefit quite a lot. And over 70% of those who used the internet-based intervention did not need to see the therapist anymore after their waiting time was over, but they didn't need to see the therapist. So that's an improvement on itself. But on top of that, what they also found was that for those who did need therapists, face-to-face consultations, they need considerably less sessions with the therapist. So they also gained something from the internet-based intervention. So that's actually what stepped care is. You get some first initial resources. In this case, internet-based intervention, self-help internet-based intervention. That is then followed up with regular care, regular face-to-face treatment. And what we see from studies that analyze stepped care model was that those results are mixed, and also they reflect a little, I think, the need for political will here in this field, because yes, the costs for this kind of step care model might increase, because we need to develop the intervention itself or buy it from a private company who develop those kind of interventions and adapt it to our own services. So the cost can be higher, that's true. And also it might require more time, because you then need a therapist or a low intensity support person to step in and contact your clients or your patients. So yeah, that's what the Kendra colleagues found, that it might involve higher costs and significantly more treatment time. But also, this is a study by Duffy et al. and from Silver Cloud research team. That's a private company who provides these kind of services to Ireland's health system, and they monitor, they collect data from all the participants. And what they found is that it helps in reducing waiting times for the individuals at need. And what I mentioned earlier about Beating the Blues program, it enhances clinical efficiency. So it means that later on, at the next level, next step, participants need less intensive treatment to achieve the same effects. So yeah, we see here that it will probably we need to, this is probably not for the like individual psychologists to keep in mind, but these type of changes in services will need to involve some political will, and we might see some increase in costs in the short term. But also, what we need to factor in is, like, do people return to work at the same time after these treatments? So, say regular care and stepped care model. So maybe they then come back earlier to work and contribute in this way. So there's a lot of factors to keep in mind here, and it might be useful for those individual psychologists actually, because what sometimes happens is that at least also in the hospital I work, like if there's a question involving psychological services, of course psychologists will be invited to consult and will be asked to give their opinion. Like, do we need to do this? Is this efficacious? What do you think? So yeah, good to keep in mind the arguments for stepped care. Right. I mentioned attitudes earlier, and that it's important that the therapists themselves, would be promoting internet-based interventions. Yes, you see a familiar face here, perhaps, Neil? Familiar name? Yeah. So. Because clients tend to be more positive towards internet-based interventions than clinicians, even if there are some exceptions, but on average. And this is why we need therapists to step in and promote these internet-based interventions. But we know that they are skeptical. And this is a study by Neil. Am I pronouncing your name?
Good enough.
Yeah, and then colleagues, which was initiated here at Thomas More University by Tom Van Dale. And this is a large European study, but not only European. We had some from Lebanon.
Global, essentially.
Yeah, global. Okay. And what we found is that clinicians worry about online consultations. This is not internet-based interventions. This would be the type 2 intervention, providing treatments over internet. But I think it would, if we would do a similar study with internet-based interventions, we would probably find similar results, because it involves technology brought into the relationship between the client and the psychologist. So psychologists are concerned, and rightly so, about the performance, like how useful the technology will be for them, if it will increase their productivity, and also what about career? If I start doing online, will this help my career or not, and so on. What we also found was that psychologists who actually engage, they change their mind really quickly. Like you have to use the intervention or online consultation at least once, and then you see that it's not that bad. I can work with that. So the attitudes change rapidly if the clinician or the therapist has the opportunity to try the technology. But this is actually nothing new. Using technologies in general, new technologies, work in this way. Like there are early adopters who like to try out new things and And then from them, it rolls out and the new technologies get adopted. So this is not something very specific to the psychological treatments. This is technologies in general are at first met skeptically by the general population, and then when early adopters start using them, they get more used in general population as well. Right. Okay, and another concern from psychologists is that it's going to be hard to form therapeutic alliance with a client in internet-based environment, whether it be online consultations or internet-based interventions. But what we see is that regardless of modalities, diagnostic groups, and contact between clients and therapists, we see that clients rated alliance scores are higher every time. So we could consider if there's some attitudes of the therapist himself about the relationship with the client involved here in this equation. So so clients, they rate therapeutic alliance same as in face-to-face. Like if we were to provide two different treatments for the same person, they would probably say, yeah, good therapeutic alliance, good relationship with the therapist. We agreed on the goals. I felt understood. That's what therapeutic alliance captures, and so on. But then the therapists usually say, no, it's harder. We don't agree on goals that much, and so on. So therapeutic alliance is also one of the things that prevents psychologists from endorsing internet-based interventions, internet-based treatments. But studies show that it's probably more of an attitude thing than the actual relationship between the client and the therapist. Okay. This is not talked about very much, especially in the scientific community, and it has been for some time. I think the situation is getting better now, and we see more and more studies reporting negative effects and negative results. But it has been quite difficult to publish results with negative effects and negative outcomes. There's a study by Alexander Rosenthal from Stockholm University and colleagues. They did a patient-level meta-analysis to check if deterioration was similar between active groups or intervention groups and the control groups. And what they found is that actually receiving any kind of treatment, internet-based treatment, is better than receiving none. And we see that, for example, in the waiting list groups, there's a significantly larger proportion of those experiencing deterioration at follow-up. So yeah, but this is something we need to keep in mind. Of course, there are, as in face-to-face therapy, also in internet-based interventions, negative effects occur, and it is important for us to document them and register them and report them in order to improve our interventions, actually. Because what I did say at the beginning of this talk is that they found good effectiveness, good efficacy for internet-based treatments. But what I didn't say is that these effects have not increased dramatically throughout the years. So we have now roughly, it's been expanding exponentially, this field, research in this field. And what we don't see is the increase in effects, actually. Yeah. So what we don't see is the increase in effects. More or less, we will find the same effect sizes over and over and over and over again. And they're fine, but if, say, 50% of our target group improves, is that enough? Or can we improve the intervention? Can we make it better? So I think one of the factors that we need to keep in mind is these negative effects and what's happening with people who experience them. Perhaps they shouldn't have been enrolled in the intervention. Maybe it's not for them. Maybe they need more specific treatment. What's happening here? Are we dealing with outliers or something? So definitely an important thing to keep in mind while thinking about implementing internet-based interventions in your settings, in your team here. Okay, and this is the last theme or last topic I'd like to address today. So some successful implementation examples in private and public sectors. Can I interact with audience? Or what you don't? People online don't see the audience. Okay. Yeah. Well, it won't come as a surprise to you that internet-based interventions expanded and are more research in the areas that the internet-based interventions bring most value to. So one of the advantages of internet-based interventions is their ability to improve accessibility. So I like this example about how we had face-to-face therapy, a study about brief reflective psychotherapy for post-traumatic stress disorder, and we did it at the university, and we would our participants with post-traumatic stress disorder would come in from all around Lithuania, and we had one woman who was after a very tragic accident. She lost her hand in the accident, and she would come every week. She would come from 3 hours on train to the university for 1 session, 1 hour session. Then she would go back to the to the train station, hop on the train, go back to her home, to her city where she lived, and that's every week for 16 weeks. And so having an internet-based solution, it might help. So it's not a surprise that such countries with vast territories and rural towns like Australia, USA, also Sweden, like employed internet-based interventions rapidly and do a lot of research on it. So I told you a little bit about Beating the Blues. That was a UK-based intervention and implemented in STEP here. But also, this is an example from Australia, the Mind Spot Clinic. It's not the only one, of course, in Australia, but they do provide services like internet-based interventions and also online counseling if needed for individuals. So, like every level of care that you might need, they can provide, except for face-to-face. Yeah. So, but what you need to keep in mind is the model of reimbursement in the countries. So in most European countries, we have public health sector, and we sometimes need to pay additional to get the services, but it's usually covered by our insurance. Same in Australia, same in Australia, and they can have like 20 up to 5 minutes, up to 20 appointments a year from their insurance, public health insurance. So these are only services in Australia available for anyone for free of charge to register, to enroll. And we have Headspace, Beyond Blue, Black Dog Institute, and so on. So for example, MindSpot that I showed earlier, they provide services to 25,000 Australians each year. So just one clinic, but a lot of turnout. Also, talking about stepped care, this was an initiative in the UK with Professor David Clark as one of the leaders for this initiative. It was called Improving Access to Psychological Therapies, or EAP, which recently changed their name to NHS Talking Therapies for Anxiety, Depression. But what this did was allow individuals or patients to bypass general practitioners and just register straight to the mental health professional. And internet-based treatments or interventions were part of this model. And this is a perfect example how we can implement internet-based interventions into our routine care and reduce waiting lines and improve clinical significance. Right. But I'm now rounding up, but there are some barriers to implementation. And we see that the acceptance by patients and professionals needs to be improved. To work on attitudes and stereotypes about internet-based interventions. But also, since most of these interventions are very focused on specific disorder or specific psychological problems, we need to address the question of appropriateness of some of the interventions for larger population, and think of tailoring treatments to an individual. And also, how can we implement these treatments with other technologies that are already in the services, and other not only technologies but also systems that we use in our services. And that's can we add another system with another password or something? This is also a big question for implementation. So to sum up, what I would like you to take home today is that we need your clinicians or psychologists. We need your involvement, active involvement, whether it be at the place you're working, mental health care centers, hospital or somewhere, or if you're involved in expert groups for implementation of these kind of services. We need your involvement and endorsement for internet-based interventions, because we know that they work. They might not work for very severe cases sometimes, and this is not going to replace face-to-face therapy. But if we can reduce waiting lines, if we could reduce the burden for our patients at this point in time, why not do this? So yes, involvement of mental health professionals is needed. Also, as I mentioned, we need to improve our interventions. The effect sizes are good, but they're not improving, and they're not improving for a long time now. And so something is we need to reconsider on how do we provide these therapies, and how we tailor them to individual needs of our patients. Of course, policy matters. As I said, it might involve sometimes larger investments, and we might need more more money to pour into the system. But we also need to look at the broader picture and the benefits of these interventions in the long term, and what they might how they might contribute to our economies later on when people get back to work earlier and so on. And I think the survey, the EFPA survey we did that I mentioned earlier might have hints on how to promote internet delivered interventions. And that is mainly what I mean here is that we need to try it. We need to try it and then decide if this works for me, if these kind of interventions are in line with my type of work that I do, and I can adopt them or not. Maybe not necessarily. Some people are very conservative and they only want to do face-to-face. But what our research shows is that when you try something, when you start using something, you change your mind quickly, and you can see the benefits of these kind of interventions. So I hope this has been useful to the practitioners, to psychologists joining us online, and thank you for your attention, and thank you, Tom, and your team for having me here at Thomas More University.
All right. So in the meantime, Jonas, actually have some questions that are, there's some virtual applause for you as well, just in case you were wondering. And I have some questions from, there's a lot of virtual applause in the meantime. But first, I think it's an important one by Mark Stein asking, what about legal issues? Are transnational interventions legal in regard of national regulations? Do you have any thoughts on that?
That's a big issue, actually. And I'm also involved with Lithuanian Psychological Association. We would often get inquiries about if I can, provide services to a person that's residing in your country. And those questions are usually from the countries that are heavily regulated and have really strict licensing rules. What I think is we need more common standards, and this is a bad comparison, but in European Union, we do have common standards now for food, for other things, right? And what we can import into the Union, what we cannot. So I think the EFPA's EuroSci initiative and the model of EuroSci could be a good starting point to talk about these kind of regulations. And if you have a EuroSci certificate or your program gets certified by some kind of European body, I think it should be made available for across at least Europe. But this is a good question, and I don't think it's been settled yet.
Maybe I can add one or two things. First one is I think it's that there is a regulation now in place for the software part of it all. There's a medical device regulation at an EU level since early 2021, which is not necessarily reinforced just yet, but will be increasingly, making sure that if you have a platform made, for example, in Lithuania, but accessed in Belgium or like in Spain or anywhere else, definitely within the EU, that it lives up to certain standards. But when it comes to the psychologists offering support, they will probably still only be licensed in particular countries. And we are allowed to do, to some extent, cross-border practice, but I would be reluctant at this point to make it the default. Like, for example, ideally, you refrain from doing this across borders, and if you do so, only do that with your own nationals. Like, so for example, somebody from Lithuania spending some time in Belgium, that's a fairly straightforward one. Somebody from Italy, an actual Italian treated by somebody in Lithuania who's only licensed to practice in Lithuania, that might be far more tricky. But I thought it was a nice question, and I wanted to share. There's also a question to test your own conceptual knowledge. So you've highlighted the different intervention types, like type 1, 2, 3, 4, the consumable bits.
Who's asking?
Yeah, Christine Cotter, apologies, and she has several questions for you. She's asking, how do you determine whether an intervention is a type 4 or a type 3? Like, for example, if you have a self-help intervention, but it has a forum that is also moderated by an expert, would that be a type 3 intervention for you?
Yeah, closer to type 3 than to type 4.
Okay, so...
Because the distinction here is that consumable and non-consumable. The type 4 intervention for me is something non-consumable at all. Like you have self-help materials, books that you can copy and download and everything, and then it's non-consumable. If it involves an expert moderating, it involves just a little time, their time, but still it consumes their time. So in my head, that's how I distinguish type 4 and type 3.
All right. So another question from Christine, just for the people still attending, I'm going through these chronologically. So she was also wondering, you've painted a clear and nuanced picture of the potential of these interventions, but also emphasized the fact that, well, their effectiveness often proves to be low to moderate. So Christine is asking, do we still need to push this field when we only see low to moderate effectiveness at best when it's pragmatically implemented in real world settings? Should you just continue in your domain basically, or should you just try something else?
No, that's a good question. And I think it mostly shows that the effects are moderate to large rather than small to moderate.
Important distinction.
And also, we must factor in other benefits like reducing travel time and also improving accessibility and also reducing stigma. Or at least reducing the consequences of stigma for getting the mental health treatments. So I think there are more to it than only effectiveness or efficacy, but also other benefits that we need to factor in when thinking about implementing or developing these type of interventions. So I will continue in this field.
All right, good to hear. Hedwig Kleis was wondering whether there's any research concerning the client side of these interventions, like, for example, with your platform or any other interventions you're aware of, has user experience research been conducted on this?
Yes, it has. Usually the experience from the user is quite positive, and I can't cite it now out of my mind, but they would usually recommend the intervention. They would usually, I'm not sure, not actually an expert in this field, but when it comes to paying for the intervention thing, this I'm not sure, like how good we are at this. But it's also culturally, I think, influenced, because if you're used to getting your health services free of charge or covered by your like public health insurance, why would you want to pay for something? And on the other hand, like in the United States, when you have to pay for your services anyway, or get an insurance yourself and decide how much you want to be covered, it's more common to purchase these type of apps. And I actually know a company from Lithuania that thrives from this and offers services only to United States. Not only, but mostly to United States.
Maybe to further clarify a little bit, I think Harry was also asking specifically for like the UX bit of it.
Oh, UX
like,
bit.
The user experience aspect of these digital interventions.
That's a good question, yeah. It seems that the materials matter more than the user experience, like the surface of the so gamification and those kind of things. they do produce might help improve effects a little, but only a little. And mostly it's good material that matters. Good material, good therapeutic material. So therapeutic knowledge put into the intervention. User experience from what I've read is usually accounts for just a small portion of the effects achieved.
Maybe a quick question for me intermittently. Are you okay with it if we would share your contact details in the chat, just in case if people have, because they're not on the slides here. So everybody, I'll just give you can call him. It's not calling, it's an email. You can email him day and night and he'll answer like within an hour or two. I think that's part of the deal. No, hesitate to send them any messages.
That's not something my project manager would agree.
Yeah, just in case if you're not able to stick around, because I'm going to continue onward. So Christine came back with a question. I think Christine kind of answered this, like asking whether psychological digital interventions tested and registered, whether there are already ones tested and registered as medical devices. And I think there are, but very few, right? Deprexis, for example, is a big one. That's actually registered as a medical device, for example, and also actively reimbursed in Germany. You can actually find a lot of German internet-based interventions that are currently reimbursed within their DIGA framework. But you see increasingly, but you don't see anyone is in Belgium, if you're wondering. So we're running a little bit behind as far as that's concerned. So is there some cost effectiveness study on these type of interventions that you could recommend to read? So that's a question from Excel Scamilla, no?
Not really, actually. I've read some.
But you wouldn't recommend them? Or?
No, but what I would do now, I would go to some Google Scholar or somewhere and would look for them, but not something on the top of my mind.
Okay, so my recommendation still would be to send him an email and he'll gladly some suggested reading, right? I mean,
yes, that would
I do
have them in my mentally.
Yeah, so that I understand. Any data about online interventions with families by any chance? Is a question by Marijan Schön, if I pronounce this correctly.
Not from the top of my head, but
again, Marie.
I actually remember at least presentations in conferences, also for family settings as well. So couples, family settings.
So feel free to
also adolescents and school children.
Okay, so I have something. Well, schools. It's a good follow-up because she was also wondering whether there are e-interventions for higher education institutions in specific. I think feel free to reach out. Perhaps from a Belgian point of view, it's always interesting to take a quick look at Moodspace, which is a Belgian site. It's in Dutch and English, so that might be interesting for an international audience as well. And then we're almost there, Jonas. It's quite hot in here as well, so that we will look into some cooling down essentially. So a question concerning the insurances: if I use a platform for my interventions, do you have to inscribe, register to a cyber insurance as a psychologist, or is this the responsibility of the owner of the platform? I think it's a very practical but a very relevant question. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that bit.
Again, could you?
Yeah, so if she delivers interventions, or if she uses a platform to deliver interventions, is she does she need to cyber insure herself for if anything goes wrong, or would that be the responsibility of the platform operator essentially?
Well, that would depend, I guess, on the country as well. Because we don't have licensing body that would license all psychologists, and especially practicing online during online therapies. So in this case, no, you wouldn't need to do that. But it depends on the local law.
There have been examples of platforms where things go severely wrong, like in Norway not too long ago, where a large platform was hacked and data was actually also exposed, and the client confidentiality essentially was broken because they just had transcript of text. And it was a responsibility there of the platform and I think that will increasingly be the bit. If you use a technology and it has like medical device regulation, it has a CE marking, then it essentially takes away, not all, but most of the responsibility. Obviously, if you as a psychologist use an online platform and you share your passwords and login data publicly to everybody, you will still probably be held accountable.
Or leave your laptop
open or do have online sessions like in front of a whole classroom, breaching confidentiality. That would be an issue. But in general, the idea would still be that platforms would probably be held accountable. Maybe one final question, maybe a good one to wrap things up as well. Just to give people an idea, we've talked about therapist support as well, and I do get that not everybody readily has access to a platform at the moment. They cannot necessarily find in their respective countries platforms that they can easily use. However, they might be able to find a number of applications, be it apps or websites that are perhaps more psychoeducational in nature or whatever. If they would, for example, like to make use of that, and they would like to have people, like, for example, use an application like Headspace or whatever, are there any suggestions you have when it comes to like the role that they could take to have their clients make the most of these type of apps? Any suggestions in that domain based on the research you're aware of and you've done in concerning the therapist guided interventions, or is that too far of a leap?
Let me
if they want their clients to start using apps.
Right.
What would be their specific, are there things that they should or shouldn't do to help them make the most of it, basically?
Of course, I think it would be important that the psychologist himself researches the app himself beforehand. That's I think really important, because if you haven't tried it, please don't recommend it. So that's probably the most important one thing. But also, it's how we use it. If it's in our face-to-face treatment that's ongoing, we would probably want something that helps us speed up the process or make it more effective. So sometimes mood tracking apps or relaxation apps, something like that could be of use. When we talk about internet-based interventions with therapist support, that's a bit different domain than there. And the emphasis here is on the intervention itself, and the therapist would just be like a supporting role, so to speak. So yeah, that's a bit different scenario, and it could be in a blended care domain. That we use apps, we use wearables to try and track, see the progress, and also help gain very specific skills like relaxation skills, and perhaps even emotion regulation skills when something pops up. So does that answer your question?
It does. I think so.
Yeah.
Keeping track of time, I think we're going to wrap it up here. I would like to thank everybody for attending, both in person, like withstanding the heat, but also online, just attending. As said before, but I'm going to repeat it briefly now as well. We'll be sending you in a couple of days the recording of this webinar alongside with Jonas's slides. You now have his email as well, so don't hesitate to ask any questions if they pop up. And so this is a first webinar on internet interventions. Several more are scheduled for in the fall, and many forthcoming as well. So if you liked it and thought this was interesting, there might be other topics and more to pick up on in the near future as well. So thank you all. Have a nice day. Thank you, Jonas, for attending, and hopefully we can see you next time. So
thank you for having me.
Okay,
Cheers, everyone.
Bye-bye.